Have you ever imagined living in a place where every step was controlled by fear, where the whip tore not only the skin but also the soul, and where chains turned lives into silence? The history of slavery in the United States is not just about forced labor. It is about brutal punishments, about enslaved children torn from their mothers, about women treated as merchandise, and about men branded with hot iron as if they were animals. In this video, you will uncover the hidden secrets of the American slave quarters, understand how the plantation house sustained its luxury with blood and tears, and learn about the cruelest punishments that defined centuries of racism and pain. But prepare yourself, some of these stories are so intense that even today they echo like invisible chains. Are you ready to hear what has never been told? Stay with me until the end and discover why the memory of slavery still shapes the present. The whip was, without a doubt, the cruelest symbol of slavery in the United States. It was not just an instrument of physical punishment, but also a psychological mechanism that dominated both bodies and minds. Every crack that cut through the air announced more than pain. It announced the reminder that enslaved people were not considered human beings, but property, living merchandise at the service of the plantation house. The scene was common on plantations. The overseer, always with his cold, watchful gaze, walked between the rows of men and women working under the scorching sun. In his hands, the coiled whip, ready to be used at the slightest sign of exhaustion or disobedience. All it took was for one enslaved person to slow down, stumble, or even lift their head in a gesture of resistance for the crack to echo, followed by muffled cries. The marks remained on the skin, but the real scar was left on the soul. Historical accounts reveal that the lashings were not counted with mercy but with spectacle. 50, 100, sometimes 200 lashes inflicted with cruelty before other enslaved people turned punishment into a public lesson. The whipping post and the pillory became stages of humiliation. The tied body, torn skin, and blood dripping on the ground became a warning. Anyone could be next. But the whip was not only used to punish, it was also a tool of preventive fear. Many overseers flaunted it openly, wrapped around their arms or dragged on the ground, as if it were an extension of their authority. The sound of leather striking the dry earth of the quarters or the overseer's boots served as a constant reminder that freedom did not exist. It was the invisible power that controlled without words. For enslaved women, the whip took on an even crueler perversity. Many times they were punished not only for their work, but for resisting sexual abuse or for trying to protect their children. The sight of a mother being whipped in front of her child was designed to break both spirits. The child learned from a very early age that there was no salvation against the power of the master and the overseer, while the mother was left marked by impotence and trauma. And we cannot forget the punishments known as the torture of the whip. On some plantations, overseers dipped the whip's tips in salt water or even gunpowder to intensify the pain and prolong the wounds. Then they forced the punished to return to work with open skin exposed to sun and dust. The physical suffering was only part of it. The greater intention was to destroy any remaining trace of dignity. Every crack of the whip also resounded in the collective memory of the enslaved. Many described in preserved testimonies that the sound lingered in their minds for days, causing nightmares. It was a trauma that did not end when the punishment ended. The body healed, but the spirit remained chained to the memory. Yet, paradoxically, the whip also became a symbol of silent resistance. Each scar on the body was also proof of survival. Many enslaved people who escaped and sought refuge in maroon communities or with the abolitionist movement showed their scars as testimony of the barbarity they endured. Marked skin then became a living denunciation against the slave system. The whip, therefore, was more than a piece of leather. It was the embodiment of structural racism, institutionalized violence, and the systematic attempt to reduce people to objects. But even in the face of so much pain, there was something the whip could not completely destroy: hope. In the songs sung in the quarters, in the silent prayers during the night, in the eyes searching for freedom, there remained a spark of resistance that not even the cruelest overseer could erase. And if the whip represented the audible terror of slavery, another even heavier symbol awaited those who dared to defy the system: the chains. Not only the iron chains that bound wrists and ankles, but also the invisible chains that imprisoned the minds and spirits of the enslaved. If the whip tore the skin, the chains of iron and of fear ensnared the entire being. But how were these chains used to control, humiliate, and enslave? That is what we will discover in the next chapter. If the whip represented immediate pain, the chains symbolized the constant weight of slavery. In the United States, the metallic sound of chains was as present as the crack of the whip. Men and women were shackled by their wrists, ankles, and even their necks as if they were dangerous animals. These chains not only restricted movement, but also reduced human beings to the condition of merchandise, property with no value beyond forced labor. The iron chains were cold and relentless. Worn for long periods, they left deep marks on the skin, caused infected wounds, and often led to death from untreated infections. Enslaved people who tried to escape were captured and displayed back in the quarters with thick chains as an example of punishment. The goal was not only to restrain the body, but to crush any dream of freedom. The physical weight of the chains mirrored the psychological weight of submission. But there were also invisible chains, perhaps even crueler than the iron ones. They were made of fear, blackmail, and humiliation. Many enslaved people remained submissive, not just because of shackles, but because they knew that if they resisted, their families would pay the price. A mother who tried to escape might see her child sold in a faraway market. A rebellious father might be separated forever from his wife. This manipulation turned slavery into a prison without walls, where obedience was bought with emotional threats. The invisible chains also appeared in the religion imposed by the masters and in the propaganda of structural racism. Many enslaved people were convinced that servitude was their fate, a divine punishment, or a natural condition. This type of psychological control was one of slavery's most effective weapons. Keeping the body imprisoned was simple, but keeping the mind imprisoned was the true strategy of domination. During the long voyages of the slave ships, iron chains were used to shackle dozens of men and women in tiny spaces, crammed together in the damp and dark hold. But even when the ship docked and the shackles were removed, the feeling of imprisonment remained. Many enslaved people reported that even without chains, they still felt bound by the constant vigilance of overseers, the threat of the pillory, and the merciless gaze of the masters. And it was not only about restraining bodies. Chains were used as symbols of humiliation. Enslaved people were forced to parade in chains in public squares or slave markets, displayed as merchandise before buyers who inspected muscles, teeth, and age. Each chain reinforced the idea of ownership. This man or this woman belongs to someone. Freedom was stripped away not only physically, but also from their very identity. Even so, resistance found ways to break the chains, both visible and invisible. Many enslaved people escaped, soared through shackles, or risked their lives crossing rivers and forests in search of maroon communities or escape routes to abolitionist states. For them, each broken chain was more than an act of personal liberation. It was an act of defiance against the entire slave system. And even today, the chains of slavery echo as a metaphor. Structural racism, social inequality, and the memory of the slave quarters continue to imprison in invisible ways the descendants of the enslaved. The chains may no longer be made of iron, but they are made of prejudice, discrimination, and denied opportunities. This legacy shows that slavery did not end when the shackles were broken. It left behind chains that still weigh on generations. Thus, the chains of slavery, both visible and invisible, were as brutal as the whip. They did not only immobilize bodies, but tried to paralyze dreams. Yet if cold steel was already cruel, there were punishments even more perverse, carried out when night fell, far from the eyes of those who might bear witness. And when the silence of night enveloped the slave quarters, the most feared torment began. The stocks, the pillory, and hidden tortures became instruments of endless pain. In the next chapter, you will discover how the torment of the night became one of the cruelest weapons of slavery. When the sun set and darkness covered the plantations, the silence of the night in the slave quarters was rarely a sign of rest. For many enslaved people, it was precisely at that moment that the most dreaded ordeal began. Away from the eyes of visitors and neighbors, overseers and masters inflicted brutal punishments, taking advantage of the darkness to hide marks and stifle screams. This period became known in preserved accounts as the torment of the night. The stocks were one of the most used tools. The enslaved person was immobilized, arms and legs locked in heavy wood, leaving the body exposed. There they remained for hours, unable to move, subjected to insects, cold, and hunger. Often the stocks were not only a physical punishment, but also a psychological one. They were used as a threat, showing all others the fate of those who dared to defy order. The mere sight of the stocks in the yard of the quarters already sent shivers down spines. The pillory, in turn, represented public humiliation. Erected in squares or near the plantation house, it was a tall post where the enslaved were tied to be flogged before everyone. During the day, it served as a spectacle of terror. At night, it became a stage for silent torments. There, the whip tore into flesh. But the true goal was to break the spirit. It was the pedagogy of fear, one punished body to keep hundreds subdued. In the torment of the night, punishments went beyond lashings. Many enslaved people were forced to spend entire nights without sleep, in uncomfortable positions, with chains tight around ankles and wrists. Others were forced to carry enormous weights, logs, or stones as punishment. The exhaustion of forced labor during the day turned into nocturnal torture, an endless cycle of suffering. The use of fire was another cruel face of this torment. There are accounts of enslaved people burned with torches or embers as warnings. The branding iron, used to mark them like cattle, was also applied at night, when the darkness helped conceal the screams that echoed in the night. These acts were deliberate. By day, labor sustained the wealth of the plantation house. By night, violence sustained absolute control, and it was not only bodies that suffered. Enslaved women were victims of even crueler torments. Many were raped at night under the cover of darkness, turned into sexual property for masters and overseers. Those who resisted were punished exemplarily, whipped to exhaustion, so that others would not dare to refuse. The night, which should have been a time of rest, became a field of psychological and physical terror. Despite this, the torment of the night was also remembered as a moment of silent resistance. On the same nights when screams were carried by the wind, songs and whispered prayers in the quarters kept hope alive. Even lying on hard mats, with wounded bodies and weary souls, many enslaved people chanted African songs or adapted biblical psalms, asking for strength to endure and courage to resist. These rituals were ways of breaking, even for an instant, the invisible chains imposed by the system. The torment of the night, therefore, was more than a punishment practice. It was a symbol of the slave system in the United States. It showed how violence had no limit of time or place. The day was for forced labor, the night for punishment and humiliation. There was no respite. With each sunrise, new bodies were scarred, new wounds opened, and the wheel of suffering continued to turn. And yet, even in the height of darkness, there was something that not even the torment of the night could completely extinguish. The flame of memory. Every muffled scream, every silent tear, every scar recorded for future generations that slavery was not just an economic system, but an open wound on human dignity. But if the night was the stage for hidden torments, there was a punishment even more cruel, capable of leaving marks for a lifetime. In the next chapter, you will learn about the practice of branding with hot iron, where flesh was turned into merchandise and pain into an eternal mark. If the whip and the chains already represented pain and humiliation, there was a punishment that surpassed all limits of cruelty: branding with a red-hot iron. In the United States, as in other places where slavery thrived, the bodies of the enslaved were burned with glowing iron, leaving permanent marks that turned men, women, and even children into numbered property, as if they were cattle. The iron was heated until it glowed, usually in the kitchen fires or braziers in the plantation house. The overseer or the master pressed the incandescent tip against the enslaved person's skin, burning muscles and nerves, leaving deep and often irreversible scars. The smell of burning flesh, mixed with screams, clung to the air, reminding all who witnessed that these were not considered people but possessions, marked to prevent confusion. Branding with hot iron served several purposes: identifying enslaved people belonging to a particular plantation, punishing those who tried to escape, and instilling collective fear. Each mark was a reminder of eternal submission. It did not matter if the body healed, the skin carried forever the stigma of slavery. Many abolitionists who fought against the system recorded in writings and books the image of branded bodies as living proof of brutality. Marks with the initials of the master's name, property symbols, or numbers indicating the order of purchase were common. For slaveholders and traders, these marks were like seals of authenticity. For the enslaved, they were open wounds that never stopped hurting. Beyond physical pain, there was psychological pain. Personal identity was replaced by an imposed mark, a seal that freedom had been stripped away forever. Enslaved women suffered even more from this practice. Many were branded on visible parts of their bodies, such as the face, shoulder, or chest, so that they carried the shame wherever they went. This public exposure deepened humiliation and made them even more vulnerable to abuse. Children were not spared either. Some were branded from an early age, before they could even understand what it meant to carry such stigma. Branding was also used as a warning against escape attempts. An enslaved person who dared to challenge the system was captured and branded in front of others. The pain and suffering of the victim became a spectacle of terror, reinforcing the idea that freedom had an unbearable price. And if caught again, the punishment could be even harsher: mutilation or even death. But paradoxically, these marks also became symbols of resistance. When enslaved people managed to escape to free territories or maroon communities, they displayed their scars as testimony to the barbarity they had endured. Each mark was proof of the system's cruelty and at the same time of survival against all attempts at destruction. The hot iron, designed to instill fear, ended up leaving eternal records of resistance and memory. In the archives of history, these marks became evidence. They show that slavery was not only a system of forced labor, but of institutionalized torture. Every branding iron pressed into human skin is a silent scream that still echoes today. The suffering transcended generations. Even after abolition, the descendants of the enslaved carried not only physical scars, but also the collective trauma that persisted as an invisible chain. And if the hot iron destroyed the body, there was an even more unbearable pain: seeing one's own children torn away and sold as merchandise. For many enslaved mothers, the cruelest mark was not on their skin, but in the emptiness left by the absence of their children. And if the hot iron left lifelong scars, imagine what happened when even the innocence of children was stolen. In the next chapter, you will discover the cruel fate of enslaved children and how their small bodies were turned into human merchandise. Among all the atrocities of slavery in the United States, few were as devastating as the fate imposed on enslaved children. From birth, they were not seen as human beings in development, but as economic investments. In the plantation houses, masters and overseers already calculated the future value of each child, as if they were merchandise in growth. For enslaved parents, each birth was marked not by joy, but by fear of what was to come. Many enslaved children were separated from their mothers while still very young. Sold in slave markets, they were displayed in public squares, where buyers inspected teeth, muscles, and even bone structure to predict their usefulness for labor. This cold and inhuman scene of negotiation destroyed entire families, turning maternal love into despair and childhood into merchandise. Those who remained in the quarters were forced to work from an early age. Boys and girls, even before reaching 10 years old, were made to carry water, feed animals, pick cotton, or serve at the plantation table. Their small and fragile bodies were no excuse. Forced labor shaped every gesture, every breath. Children who disobeyed were whipped, tied to the stocks, or humiliated before adults. And there was an even crueler fate, being used as wet nurses. Enslaved women were forced to breastfeed the children of the plantation mistresses, often leaving their own babies to starve. Black children grew up alongside white ones, but in opposite conditions. While some were nurtured, protected, and educated, others were treated as servants from childhood. This cruel contrast reinforced, from an early age, the invisible chains of racism. Beyond labor and exploitation, many children were victims of sexual violence. Girls were abused by masters, overseers, and even young white heirs. They grew up marked by pain and shame, never knowing the meaning of childhood. The child's body became a field of abuse, leaving emotional wounds that crossed generations. And for those who tried to escape, the punishment was even more terrible. Children were chained, exposed in pillories, whipped before their parents, all to serve as an example. The goal was to break the spirit of the enslaved community by showing that not even the most innocent were safe from the system's cruelty. Stolen childhood was also reflected in denied dreams. While white children learned to read and write, often with private tutors, black children were forbidden any formal education. Teaching an enslaved person to read was considered a crime in many southern states of the United States. This kept entire generations trapped in forced ignorance, unable to claim rights, reinforcing the invisible chains that sustained slavery. But even amid so much pain, there were moments of resistance. In the silent nights of the quarters, children learned African songs, stories of their ancestors, and whispered prayers. These fragments of culture and faith were passed down as seeds of hope. Hidden laughter, improvised games with stones or pieces of wood, were acts of silent rebellion against a system that sought to suffocate even innocence. The cruel fate of enslaved children is a reminder that slavery did not only affect adults of working age, but an entire generation from birth. It stole not only the present, but also the future. The small bodies carried iron chains, but also invisible chains that stretched across centuries and still echo in today's social inequality and structural racism. And if even children were treated as merchandise, imagine what happened when the adult body could no longer endure the burden of forced labor. In the next chapter, you will discover the silent punishment that forced many enslaved people to work until they dropped dead. Among all the punishments imposed on the enslaved in the United States, there was one that did not leave immediate visible scars, yet was perhaps the most silent and devastating: the punishment of working until death. Unlike the whip or the branding iron, it required no public spectacle. Its cruelty manifested in the exhausting routine, the continuous exploitation, and the slow wearing down of the human body to its limit. The days began before sunrise. Still in darkness, enslaved people were awakened by the sound of bells, whistles, or the overseer's shouts. With no right to proper rest, insufficient food, and often carrying open wounds from previous punishments, they were forced into workdays of 16 or even 18 hours. On cotton plantations, in sugar and tobacco fields, or in the domestic service of the plantation house, the rule was simple: never stop. This punishment required no chains or pillories. Forced labor itself, without breaks, was the instrument of torture. Weakened, elderly, or sick enslaved people were forced to keep the same pace as the youngest. Those who could not keep up were punished with the whip and in many cases left to die in the fields without any care. The message was clear. The value of each life was limited to its capacity to generate profit. Extreme exhaustion often led to fainting. There are accounts of enslaved people collapsing in the middle of cotton rows and being awakened by lashes. Others were simply dragged away and abandoned. Death from exhaustion was seen as natural, part of the cycle of exploitation. For the masters, there was always another slave ship bringing new bodies to replace those who could not survive. Pregnant women were not spared this torment. Many were forced to work until their last days of pregnancy, carrying heavy loads and harvesting under the scorching sun. If they fainted or lost the baby, there was no compassion. The profit of the plantation house outweighed life itself. Children were also pushed into this cycle of exhaustion from an early age, learning that the only rule was to endure. Forced labor until death did not only destroy the physical body, but also corroded dignity. By turning each person into a mere cog in the machine of production, slavery reduced entire lives to economic statistics. It was the complete denial of humanity. Every drop of sweat, every strained muscle, every labored breath became part of the mechanism that sustained the master's luxury and the wealth of a nation. Yet, even in this scenario of exhaustion, there was resistance. Many enslaved people found small ways to fight back, deliberately slowing their pace, hiding tools, feigning illness, or discreetly helping weaker companions bear the weight of the day. These gestures, seemingly small, were enormous acts of courage against a system that sought to erase every trace of solidarity. Death from exhausting labor, however, was never in vain. Each body that fell in the fields was a silent witness to the brutality of the slave system. And each survivor who carried the marks of fatigue on their face perpetuated the memory that freedom could never be forgotten. The torment of working until death did not end when the shackles were broken. It became a symbol of the invisible chains that still imprison societies marked by exploitation and structural racism. But if death by exhaustion was already cruel, there was a punishment even more devastating, one capable of destroying not only the body, but also self-esteem. In the next chapter, you will learn about the public humiliation of the pillory and how it became a psychological weapon of control and shame. If forced labor destroyed the body slowly, the pillory destroyed the soul in public squares. This wooden post, erected in city centers or on plantations, was more than an instrument of physical punishment. It was a theater of collective humiliation. Tying an enslaved person to the pillory exposed them to the judgment of the entire community, turning their pain into spectacle and their dignity into scorn. Overseers led the condemned to the base of the pillory and shackled their wrists and ankles with iron chains. There, in front of masters, enslaved people and onlookers, the ritual of shame began. The whip tore into the flesh, but the intention was not only to inflict pain. The true goal was to crush the spirit, extinguish the last spark of pride, and show that any attempt at resistance would be crushed before all. Public humiliation was carefully planned. Many enslaved people were punished for crimes, such as looking a master in the eyes, speaking without permission, attempting to escape, or simply questioning orders. At the pillory, these offenses were turned into spectacle, reinforcing the social and racial hierarchy. The message was clear: this is the place you occupy, and any attempt to change it will be punished before everyone. For enslaved women, the pillory assumed an even greater cruelty. Many were exposed with torn or scant clothing, whipped under the lustful gazes and comments of masters and overseers. The punishment was both physical and sexual violence, a double humiliation that scarred body and memory. Mothers who tried to protect their children were especially punished, forced to endure the shame in front of them as a strategy to break family bonds. Combined punishments were common. After lashings, the enslaved person remained exposed for hours at the pillory with open wounds, for all to see the result of disobedience. Flies swarmed on cuts, the sun burned the wounded skin, and thirst slowly consumed the body. Every minute was calculated torture to turn life itself into an example. The pillory punished not only the individual, but the entire enslaved community. By witnessing the scene, men, women, and children learned that obedience was the only path to survival. Fear spread like an invisible chain, reinforcing the master's control without the need for words. It was a spectacle of terror that molded behavior and silenced voices. Yet, even before public shame, there was resistance. Many enslaved people faced the pillory in silence, with a firm gaze, refusing to cry out. Others sang spiritual hymns or chanted words in African languages, turning punishment into an act of cultural affirmation. These gestures, seemingly small, were seeds of resistance that inspired others not to lose hope. The pillory, meant to be a symbol of power, also became a symbol of memory. After abolition, many of these posts were torn down, but others remained as reminders of barbarity. In various cities, the pillory still stands as a historical monument, not to celebrate the past, but to ensure the humiliation suffered there is never forgotten. Public humiliation was one of slavery's most effective strategies. It not only punished, but also molded minds. The pillory turned pain into spectacle, suffering into a lesson, and shame into an invisible chain. Yet even in the face of such terror, the flame of resistance never went out. And it was precisely that flame that gave rise to communities of escape and freedom, known as maroon societies. But if the pillory represented public shame, the maroon communities represented secret hope. In the next chapter, you will discover the stories of resistance, escape, and rebuilding that proved that even in the midst of pain, freedom was never forgotten. If the pillory was a symbol of shame, the maroon communities were a symbol of hope. In the United States, just as in Brazil and the Caribbean, many enslaved people refused to live only under the weight of the whip, the chains, and public humiliation. They risked their lives to escape, crossing swamps, rivers, forests, and mountains in search of freedom. These refugees, known as maroon communities or settlements of fugitives, became territories of resistance where dignity could flourish again. Escapes often happened at night. Guided by the stars, enslaved people followed secret routes, aided by freed blacks, abolitionists, or even indigenous communities that offered shelter. The sound of chains breaking was replaced by the pounding of their hearts, by the whisper of hope. Every step toward freedom was also a challenge to the slave system. The maroon communities in the United States took many forms. Some were small groups hidden in forests, living in makeshift cabins and surviving on hunting and farming. Others were larger, fortified communities where fugitives organized defense systems and even traded goods with neighbors. These places represented more than survival. They were spaces of cultural rebuilding, where African songs were preserved, rituals practiced, and stories of resistance passed down from generation to generation. But living in a maroon community was not easy. Danger was constant. Masters and slave hunters organized expeditions to capture fugitives and destroy their settlements. The Maroons lived always alert, ready to fight or flee again. Many preferred risking their lives in combat rather than returning to the torment of the quarters. Each community destroyed gave rise to new groups, spreading the flame of resistance across different regions. One of the most powerful symbols of this struggle was the so-called Underground Railroad, the secret network of routes and safe houses that helped enslaved people reach free states in the North or even Canada. Though not a Maroon community in the traditional sense, this network functioned as a vast solidarity movement, connecting fugitives and supporters in a common cause. For many, it was the road to freedom. The existence of Maroon communities directly challenged the logic of slavery. They proved that despite the whip, the branding iron, the pillory, and forced labor, the human spirit could not be completely tamed. With every escape, with every community formed, enslaved people showed that the pursuit of freedom was stronger than any iron chain. These refugees also carried deep symbolic meaning. In the Maroon communities, enslaved people regained their names, their traditions, their family and community ties. It was as if they were reborn, rebuilding what slavery had tried to erase. Many descendants of these communities still carry the memory of their ancestors who dared to resist, proving that freedom won through blood and struggle must never be forgotten. The history of slavery in the United States is not only the story of the whip and the chains. It is also the story of resistance. Every enslaved person who escaped, every Maroon community built, every song sung in the darkness of the quarters was an act of courage. It was proof that, even in the face of the greatest cruelty, there was always space to dream of freedom. Maroon communities remain today as symbols that pain could not extinguish hope. They remind us that slavery did not achieve total victory, because the flame of human dignity never goes out. Even when bodies were branded with hot iron and heavy chains tried to silence voices, there were always those who dared to cry out in silence, "Freedom is worth more than life." And that is why, when we remember the whip, the chains, the branding iron, the torment of the night, and the humiliation of the pillory, we must also remember resistance. Slavery tried to destroy bodies and souls, but it left behind something that no chain could ever hold: memory. And that memory lives on today, like an echo calling us never to forget. The whip, the chains, the branding iron, the torment of the night, the pillory, and even working until death were cruel marks of slavery in the United States. But we also find resistance, hope, and the Maroon communities that showed that even in the midst of pain, there was always a struggle for freedom. This history cannot be forgotten because the invisible chains still echo today in inequality, in racism, and in the memory we carry as a society. It is our responsibility to give voice to those who were silenced, to remember those who suffered, and to learn from their strength. If you believe this truth must be known, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video so more people can discover what history tried to hide. Because remembering is resisting, and resisting is keeping alive the dignity of all those who were once chained.